Hi, and welcome to the talk Conspicuous Consumption and Economic Reasoning in the Inequality of Wealth chapter of Juan Quan's Discourses on Salt and Iron. The Discourses on Salt and Iron, or the Yantielun, is one of the most important classical texts to survive from the 1st century BCE in Han Dynasty China. It purports to be a reasonably faithful representation of an imperial court debate held in 81 BCE between the government and its critics, ostensibly about whether to abolish the state monopolies on salt and iron production that had been imposed 4 decades previously. And while some chapters do indeed discuss the state monopolies, the topics in the debate ranged widely, touching upon all the controversial political, military, economic, and social issues of the time. The representatives for the government and his critics debate such issues as the role of government, imperial expansion, foreign relations, international trade, price controls, poverty and inequality, coinage, conspicuous consumption, legal principles, and the relative importance of agriculture versus commerce. The Discourses thus represents a rare and indispensable snapshot of the political economy of the Han Dynasty, soon after the activist and exhausting reign of Emperor Wu. The impetus for the debate was an imperial edict issued in the summer of 82 BCE by the 13-year-old Emperor Zhao, who was securely under the complete control and virtual regency of the General-in-Chief Huo Guang, the real power at court. It called for certain high capital officials and the governors of commanderies to recommend new men under the titles of worthies, xianliang, men of great reputation and outstanding character, and literati, wenxue, noteworthy classical scholars from the provinces, all of these for imperial government service. During the second lunar month of 81 BCE, these new men, more than 60 in number, had already arrived at the capital, and a further imperial edict instructed the high officials to inquire of this group what was causing the, quote, distress and suffering among the people. Min suo ji ku. These measures had apparently been first suggested to Huo Guang by Du Yanyan, who was an advisory counselor at court and who longed for a return to the more frugal and conservative days of Emperor Wen. After the submission of written responses to the query, which all asked for abolition of the government's salt and iron monopolies, a multi-day court deliberation, which might have been actually spread over several months, became the venue for an oral presentation. This became the famous debate on salt and iron, though those government monopolies were not the only subject for discussion. The staging and timing of the debate in 81 BCE, in which Confucian learning scholars criticized government financial policies, was really a clever political attack by Huo Guang against the architect of the government's schemes, Sang Hongyang, who was a technocrat with legalist sympathies and a powerful, long-standing rival of Huo Guang at court. A generation after the court debate, Juan Quan, a scholar of the Gongyang commentary to the Chunxiu, and a regional government official under the reign of Emperor Xuan, read transcripts of the oral discussion and written copies of policy suggestions from the debate, which were in wide circulation during his time. He felt that the worthies and the literati made extremely important points, but that their expositions were not comprehensive or detailed enough, so he expanded certain sections, added appropriate headings, and gave it some literary polish, and reframed it all as a lively dialogue, compiling the Discourses on Salt and Iron we have today. Though Juan Quan was a solid Confucian scholar and was noticeably partial to the worthies and the literati during the debate, he also presented the government side of the argument with surprising fidelity. The book is preserved in 60 chapters of various length. It can be divided into 2 parts, or let's say 3 parts. The first 41 chapters consist of a representation and recreation of the initial court debate in 81 BCE, with a final section providing the summary and compromise outcome of the discussion. Chapters 42 to 59 represent the arguments of a further discussion held after the initial court debate, probably in the offices of the chief prosecutor, and reiterates many of the points already made in the earlier debate. And then the final chapter, chapter 60, provides Juan Quan's final observations. The Discourses is invaluable for understanding the political currents and economic policies of the most populous empire on earth at the turn of the Common Era. In no other ancient text are the most contentious issues in early Chinese political economy debated so forcefully and clearly. The discourses also provide a unique view of contemporary social developments, such as conspicuous consumption, our subject today, and competitive display. The longest chapter in the entire compilation is the Inequality of Wealth, Xianbuzu chapter. It is also the most difficult to read and translate given the hundreds of specialized terms for material culture it contains and the presence of numerous loans and mistaken and corrupted characters in the text. The previous English translation of the Discourses on Salt and Iron by S. N. Gale from 1931 and 1934 stopped just short of this chapter, and for good reason. The Inequality of Wealth chapter is also different in structure from most of the other parts of the Discourses. It seems to form the centerpiece of a multi-chapter suite with chapter 28, Guoji, the Maladies of the State, a heated and personal exchange wherein the pernicious wealth inequality belaboring the empire since early in the reign of Emperor Wu is first discussed, and chapter 30, Jiu Kui, Rescuing the Needy, where the scholars propose some possible solutions to these problems, such as prohibiting extravagance by officials and abolishing monopolies on salt and iron. Unlike most of the other chapters, which present a focused back-and-forth debate on a specific topic, like frontier defense or currency policy, the Inequality of Wealth opens with a relatively brief repartee consisting of a dismissive insult from the chief prosecutor Sang Hongyang, countered by a rather defensive reply from the worthies. Following this, the chief minister, Tian Qianqiu, interrupts to ask the worthies, "I want to hear about the instances of plenty and want throughout the empire." What follows is an elaborate presentation of extravagant cultural practices and conspicuous consumption in 8 categories, summarized by the worthies as palatial residences, horse and carriage teams, clothing, vessels and armaments, funerary and sacrificial rituals, banquets of food and alcohol, lewd music and feminine charms, and other delightful things and amusing pursuits. And these encompass 32 specific examples. Here is just one of them from my upcoming full translation. In ancient times, only when commoners became quite advanced in years would they be clothed in silk, while all other commoners would just wear hemp and cloth. That is why commoners were often referred to by the epithet hemp wearers. In later times, people often wore robes with silk linings while the exterior was still fashioned of hemp. They wore straight collar-style robes without an added waist sash, and though the seams of the robe's panels could be enhanced with stitched embroidery, no decoration was added to them. Wearing transparent gauze, fine white silks, and embroidery was the privilege of queens and consorts of the ruler, and robes padded with silk floss and made with glossy, double-threaded silk was beautiful attire reserved for wedding ceremonies. That is why embroidery and fine silks were not sold in the marketplace. Nowadays, the wealthy outfit themselves in magnificent colored embroidery and the finest silks or transparent gauze. Those of middle-level wealth wear thick, glossy silks and fresh-as-ice brocades. Regular people now wear clothing only appropriate to queens and royal consorts, and uncouth persons go around in wedding attire. And though white silk taffeta might be twice as expensive as regular double-threaded silk cloth, that double-threaded silk has twice the useful life of silk taffeta. Given the elaborate structure of this chapter and the numerous items of clothing and food enumerated in some of the paragraphs, it seems to me that this could not have been presented orally as part of the court deliberation in the presence of the emperor. If it were presented at court, it must have been read aloud from a prepared or memorized text, or presented as a written memorial beforehand. More likely, it was compiled into the Yantielun decades after the original debate by Huan Quan from a prepared literary text, either composed by himself or some other anonymous author. If the text of the chapter were from the time of the original debate, then it must have been taken by Huan Quan from one of the memorials that formed the initial responses to Emperor Zhao's edict, and not from transcriptions of the later oral argument component. Huan had commented in his conclusion that the literates and worthies in the debate had not really been able to fully expound their ideas, so he expanded on them for them. So I would suggest that the brief and poorly organized argument against conspicuous consumption that appears in the heated debate of chapter 28 was expanded by Huan Quan into the much more organized presentation in Chapter 29, the inequality of wealth. So according to the worthies, their presentation was structured as a comparison between the cultural practices between the past and the present. Using the supposed golden age of the past to criticize the present was a common method of argument for Confucian scholars, and this is what so enraged Li Si and the first emperor of Qin, leading to the infamous burning of the books in 213 BCE. In the inequality of wealth, the scholars actually refer to three broad periods of time: Guzhe, ancient time, which they use to refer to prehistory and the era of the three emperors, Han Huang, and five sovereigns, Wu Di. Then later ages, Hou Shi, or just Qi Hou, which refers to the period of the three dynasties of the Xiaxiang and Zhou, including the Warring States period. And nowadays, Qin, meaning the Middle Western Han reigns of Emperor Wu and Emperor Zhao. For the practices of contemporary times, the scholars divide the people into three socioeconomic classes: the wealthy, Fuzhe, probably indicating princes and princesses of the royal blood, high officials, aristocrats, and wealthy industrialists or merchants of comparable means; those of moderate wealth, Zhongzhe, an urban middle class of merchants, artisans, prosperous landlords, and lower-level officials; and the poor, Pinzhe, mostly referring to struggling peasants, tenant farmers, laborers, and the urban underclass. The chapter presents a remarkable snapshot of bustling consumer society at the outset of the 2nd century BCE. We hear about lavish banquets and drunken revelries, sumptuous tableware and dazzling horse and carriage teams, fabulous silk clothing and personal ornaments, and enormous private funerary monuments and religious sacrifices. But is this really a decadent and immoral age, or is it a glorious one? That assessment probably depended on the social class which one occupied and one's relation and reaction to the literary presentation itself. The great recital of extravagant spending presented by the worthies in the inequality of wealth was supposed to have an admonitory effect on Emperor Zhao, encouraging him to restrain royal spending and rescind the government's direct involvement in the economy. But it may have made the opposite impression. Listening to such a mouth-watering litany of delicious food and dazzling luxuries might have unintentionally inflamed the emperor's desire for such things. David Connecticut has noted that the phenomenon of bedazzlement with the genre of Han rhapsodies, or fu, and in fact the litanies by the literati and the worthies in the discourses share many features with the Han poetic genre of fu. While famous rhapsodies like Sima Xiangru's Rhapsody on the Imperial Park, the Shanglin Fu, were supposedly composed to admonish the emperor against excessive use of the imperial hunting preserve. Its hypnotic verse, exhaustive lists of flora and fauna, and the bloodlust of the slaughter were so captivating and alluring that the rhapsody might have had the opposite impression. The main theme of the inequality of wealth in the discourses on salt and iron is the problem of extravagant and wasteful spending that we would call conspicuous consumption. In every human society of any measurable complexity, elites engage in wasteful consumption of food and resources that would seem to run counter to any rational economic or thermodynamic model of human behavior. In urbanized state-level societies, nobles and other elites competed in conspicuous consumption and display, showing off the largest mansions, the flashiest clothing and jewelry, and staging the most lavish banquets and funerals. So today we would say conspicuous consumption are things like cars and jewels and furs. During the Han Dynasty, that would be things like silks and mansions and lacquer vessels. So people's social inferiors in the middle class would aspire to catch up to their superiors and enter this competition for extravagance, spending beyond their means. In ancient and modern empires, the elites and middle classes also competed in displaying the wealth derived from imperial power through rare imported luxuries like fur and jewels, human slaves, as well as exotic aromatics and foods. The term conspicuous consumption was coined by the economist and sociologist Thorstein Veblen in 1899 in his book The Theory of the Leisure Class. He defined the phenomenon as wasteful spending beyond what was necessary for subsistence in a competition for prestige and power. He argued that this competition grew out of earlier exploits in primitive society, such as those derived from hunting big game or capturing women. But in more recent society, it had evolved into a rivalry among elites to gain honor or rank and to avoid shame by the display of wealth and economic power. It was related to the practice of conspicuous leisure, where elites would signal their wealth by withdrawing from productive work and only engaging in pursuits like sports, governance, or religion. Those who occupied the sub-elite stratum engaged in what was called pecuniary emulation, where they strained their finances to catch up to their social superiors. Anthropologist Bruce G. Trigger offers an analysis of conspicuous consumption similar to Veblen's, but focuses more on ancient complex societies. Employing a thermodynamic analysis, Trigger argues that in most simple and relatively egalitarian human societies, such as among hunter-gatherers or early farming societies, people follow a principle of least effort that is conservative of energy and materials and tries to garner the greatest return on the least energy and effort expended. But in more stratified complex societies, such as chiefdoms and early states, individuals or groups who want to assert their rank above others intentionally flout this universally understood principle to demonstrate their power through access to surplus resources. Think of the modern phrase, "he's got money to burn." Trigger asserts that since the control of energy constitutes the most fundamental and universally recognized measure of political power, then the most direct way to symbolically assert that power is through the, quote, conspicuous consumption of energy. A well-known example of this in chiefdom-level societies is the potlatch feasts of the Native Americans of the Pacific Northwest coast, where chiefs consumed and redistributed great amounts of their material wealth just to demonstrate that they could, and to reinforce their superiority and entangle others in reciprocal obligations. Trigger concludes that individuals and groups who engage in conspicuous consumption, quote, demonstrate their control over nature, unquote, and their ability to appropriate the labor of others shows their, quote, power over other human beings. Moving back to early China, the worthies in the Discourses on Salt and Iron propose that an insatiable craving for luxuries was an intrinsic element of human nature or feelings, renqing. They declare, when it comes to palatial residences, horse and carriage teams, clothing, vessels, armaments, funerary or sacrificial rituals, banquets of food and alcohol, lewd music, feminine charms, and other delightful things and amusing pursuits, these are the areas where human desire can never be satiated. They argue that because people could not stop themselves, the ancient sages had to step in and make sumptuary regulations to guard against excess. These guardrails have broken down in recent centuries, they contend, because high officials had abandoned propriety and righteousness to pursue profit and power, encouraging the lower classes to emulate them. This argument about human nature and the desire for luxuries ultimately goes back to the ideas of the 3rd century BCE philosopher Xunzi. The opening of Book 19, the Yantielun, states, men are born with desires, which, if not satisfied, cannot but lead men to seek to satisfy them. If in seeking to satisfy their desires men observe no measure and apportion things without limits, then it would be impossible for them not to contend over the means to satisfy their desires. Such contention leads to disorder, and disorder leads to poverty. The ancient kings abhorred such disorder, so they established the regulations contained within ritual and moral principles in order to apportion things, to nurture the desires of men, and to supply the means for their satisfaction. Xunzi was most concerned that unrestrained human desire for material goods would lead to fighting and impoverishment and eventually chaos, luan. Such behavior would also lead to the depletion of natural resources. To prevent such poverty and anarchy, the former kings instituted sumptuary regulations. But these regulations were not applied uniformly to everyone, for like Mencius before him, Xunzi believed that hierarchy and inequality was natural and necessary for human society, and that the nobles and other elites should be allowed greater consumption and display to mark their superior status. The great Confucian thinker of the Middle Western Han, Dong Zhongshu, was very critical of extravagant and conspicuous consumption and warned of the destabilizing effects they were having on contemporary governance and society. In his Chunqiu Fan Lu, the luxuriant gems of the spring and autumn, he states, great wealth gives rise to haughtiness, great poverty gives rise to desperation, desperation gives rise to thievery, and haughtiness gives rise to violence. These are the emotional propensities of the majority of human beings. But as with Xunzi, Dong Zhongshu insists that the regulations to control wealth disparity still had to ensure that the nobility could properly distinguish themselves from baseness. Dong declares, "The sage ensures that the wealthy have sufficient means to reveal their nobility and are not enriched to the point of haughtiness, and he ensures that the poor have sufficient means to nourish their lives, but are not impoverished to the point of desperation." So it was fine and natural to have rich and poor in society, so long as the rich were not too rich and the poor had just enough to get by. The Han historian Sima Qian, who knew Zhong Zhongshu and was active in the decades following Dong's withdrawal from court, also presented his thoughts about the origins of conspicuous consumption and the state's potential role in controlling it. In the Huozhi Liezhuan, the biographies of the moneymakers, chapter 129 in the Shiji, he states, "Judging by what is recorded in the Book of Songs and the Book of Documents from the age of Emperor Shun and the Xia dynasty down to the present, ears and eyes have always longed for the ultimate in beautiful sounds and forms. Mouths have desired to taste the best in grass-fed and grain-fed animals. Bodies have delighted in ease and comfort, and hearts have swelled with pride at the glories of power and ability. So long have these habits been allowed to permeate the lives of people that though if one were to go from door to door preaching the subtle arguments of the Taoists, he could never succeed in changing them." Sima Qian differs from Xunzi in that he sees these desires, yu, not as intrinsic urges that humans are born with, but as customs or habits, su, that have persisted in human society for so long that they are almost impossible to change. He therefore suggests that the ideal emperor should just accept the customs of the people and adapt to it, rather than try to suppress this habit with education or sumptuary regulations. So now I'd like to go through the historical context of this argument that the Confucians present against conspicuous consumption. During the disputations of the Warring States period, Confucians and Mohists were strongly in agreement that extravagance was immoral and endangered the state. Intricately painted and carved decoration on palaces, alluring women, and beguiling contemporary music were dangerous to the Confucians, for they could distract the ruler from proper governance, by which they meant paying attention to the welfare of the common people. The Mohists were also opposed to anything that did not have utility, meaning it would not benefit the power of the state and most of the population. They saw decorated buildings or clothing as having no utility, since simple shelter and clothing sufficed to fulfill their original purpose. They saw lavish funerals and long mourning periods as a waste of productive resources, since real wealth was buried under the ground and productive men were not allowed to work during mourning. And they saw music, banquets, and entertainments as useless, since even though they were pleasurable for the participants, they did not provide for clothing for the common people or increase the population. The Confucians and the Mohists also railed against conspicuous consumption, especially by the ruler and the aristocracy, because it put heavy burdens of taxation and labor service on the peasantry. The Confucians were concerned that when the people became exhausted, they might die, or even worse, might rebel against authority. And the Mohists were concerned that couples who were too exhausted or separated by labor service or military conscription might not have enough sex to have babies to increase the state's population. These arguments were noticeably toned down at the beginning of the Han Dynasty, since according to Sima Qian, the devastation from the civil wars at the end of the Qin and the constant demands for military and labor service left everyone destitute, including those at the top, so there was little surplus wealth to display. The Han founder increased severe sumptuary laws forbidding merchants from wearing silk or riding in carriages, and he also increased their taxes. This was supposedly done to encourage people to return to the hard task of farming rather than take up the easier occupation of merchant trader, but an additional motivation was probably to hobble the merchant's ability to conspicuously display the type of wealth that the aristocrats and high officials could not yet get their hands on. And here we have the quote from Sima Qian. "When the Han Dynasty came to power, it inherited the evils left by the Qin. The able-bodied men were all away with the army, and the old and the underage busily transported supplies for them. There was much hard work and little wealth. The Son of Heaven himself could not find 4 horses of the same color to draw his carriage, and many of his generals and ministers were reduced to riding in ox carts, and the common people had nothing to lay away in their storehouses." So within a couple decades during the reign of Empress Lu, the situation had stabilized remarkably. People had returned to till abandoned farmlands, and merchants and artisans flocked back to the cities. Clothing and food became quite plentiful. in this period, as Bangu relates. Surplus wealth began to accumulate once again in the upper strata of society, and immediately the old patterns of conspicuous consumption and pecuniary emulation reasserted themselves. During the subsequent reign of Emperor Wen, Confucian scholars found a receptive ear in the newly appointed 22-year-old emperor, who was anxious to consolidate his position as leader of the empire and ameliorate any popular discontent. A string of Confucian-leaning scholar officials inundated Emperor Wen with strongly worded memorials urging him to rein in extravagance and encourage a return to agriculture among the people. Jia Yi warned that too many people had turned their backs on agriculture and were flocking to crafts and commerce, and that, quote, extravagant practices increased day by day, and these were like great bandits against the empire. He delivered an ominous warning that, quote, the mandate of heaven, meaning the imperial throne, is like a boat about to be capsized, and there is nothing to support and save it. Chao Cuo delivered a series of frank memorials to Emperor Wen as well, warning that wealth inequality and extreme poverty would inevitably lead to crime and rebellion. He encouraged the emperor to liberally confer ranks on those who donated grain to the state, allowing agricultural taxes on peasants to be reduced or eliminated, and to reduce his personal display of luxuries like gold, silver, and pearls, which cannot be eaten so have no real value. Emperor Wen really seems to have taken these arguments to heart, for he not only greatly reduced taxes on people and encouraged agriculture by reviving a ritual where the emperor personally plowed a ritual field in the spring, but he also modeled a very modest and frugal lifestyle himself, often wearing simple black silk robes and, according to a later story, straw sandals, canceling expensive additions to the palace and selecting a more modest style of burial for himself than his predecessors, without a tall mound or any gold or silver objects. Now, according to the government critics in the discourses on salt and iron, Emperor Wen's model of humanity and frugality had lingering positive effects throughout the reign of his son, Emperor Jing. The worthies said that during this time the poor had just enough to get by with clothes on their backs and a roof over their head, but not so much that they could waste it on things like banquets or other frivolous luxuries. But then everything went to hell shortly after the accession of his grandson Emperor Wu in 140. According to their interpretation, because rapacious officials had introduced profit-making schemes into government, the people lost sight of the fundamental, leading to a situation where, quote, the rich and prominent indulged in luxury and extravagance, while the poor and humble took to robbery and murder. The Han historian Sima Qian's own account of this time provides a textbook description of the two interrelated phenomena that Veblen talked about, of conspicuous consumption and pecuniary emulation under Emperor Wu's reign. The members of the imperial house and the nobility, the high officials and the lesser government officers, strove to outdo each other in luxurious living. Zheng Yu Shechi. There was no limit to how far each would go in aping the houses, carriages, and dress of his social superiors. Now, searching for causes of the conspicuous consumption craze during the reign of Emperor Wu, we should look beyond the accumulated prosperity from previous reigns and the, quote, loosening of the net of the law that Bangu talks about that allowed the wealthy to leverage their wealth, or the immoral example of greed that was engendered by the salt and iron monopolies, pointed out by the literati and the worthies during the discourses. During the reign of Emperor Wu, the empire had also become increasingly monetized, and the government monopoly on coinage infused the economy with reliable cash. Furthermore, Emperor Wu's military expansion of the empire to the four cardinal directions nearly doubled the size of the realm and gave access to plunder and trade on an unprecedented scale. A similar phenomenon accompanied the great Roman expansion from the late Republic to the early Principate. This globalization fundamentally changed the Han economy, and one should see the critics in the discourses and their insistent call for a, quote, return to antiquity as a conservative reaction to the frightening new economic reality. We see similar conservative and nativist reactions to the increasing pace of globalization in our own era. The expansion of the empire also gave the wealthy access to a wide array of imported luxuries with which to mark their status, such as gems, rare furs like sable, exotic foods, and foreign slaves. The literati in the discourses complain that, quote, customs have degenerated in the race for extravagance, or, as we see here in this quote, barbarian products of the south and northeast are sought out to dazzle the Middle Kingdom. The display of the products of empire is a phenomenon also seen in contemporary empires in the Mediterranean and in later world empires, such as the conspicuous consumption of things like tea and sugar in the British Empire. So as introduced above, it was under the reign of Emperor Wu's son, Emperor Zhao, when these issues were debated openly in court in 81 BC. And the worthies and the literati presented the most detailed critique of conspicuous consumption ever written, framed as a comparison between a simpler and more frugal antiquity and the immoral extravagance of the present day. But the real man in charge of the empire, the general-in-chief Huo Guang, only staged this debate to attack his enemies at court, and so he only allowed moderate austerity measures before and after the debate, such as eliminating the monopoly on alcohol products, reducing or remitting some taxes on commoners, and eliminating a few government bureaus. So let's go through the major points of the Confucian argument against conspicuous consumption that we see in the discourses on salt and iron. So first of all, we have this idea of the fundamental occupation, which was agriculture, and the peripheral occupations, which was artisan work or being a merchant. And so this argument goes back to the Warring States period and the first great economic expansion and monetization of the Chinese economy, where scholars were concerned that if people abandoned agriculture and went to the cities to be merchants and artisans, that people would starve. So they say in the discourses, if men abandon the fundamental occupation in favor of the peripheral, there will not be enough grain to eat. So this assumes then that the resources of nature and human labor are finite things, and that there is no effect of supply and demand. That if the price of grain goes up because there are less farmers, then more people would become farmers. These are sort of modern mechanisms of supply and demand. They believed that every farmer feeds a certain number of people, so that if you have one less farmer, you're going to have people starving somewhere. So according to the Confucian argument, extravagant spending by the ruler and his government not only put additional burdens on the poor through greater labor exactions and taxation, but also generated a larger wealth inequality between the rich and the poor. Since the ruler set the model for emulation, his extravagant spending would encourage elites to mirror his lifestyle and to compete with one another in wealth accumulation and conspicuous consumption. And since the resources and wealth of the world were viewed as finite, the only way the rich could get richer, so they could have more wealth to display, would be to take it from those who are already impoverished. A cynical line in the Lao Tzu text elaborates on this idea when it says, if it's heaven's way to take from those who have too much to give to those who have not enough, this is far from being man's way. He takes away from those who have not enough in order to make an offering to those who already have too much. So whereas nature automatically smooths out inequality to make an equilibrium in the Taoist view, just as mountains erode to fill valleys, the way of the human world is to exacerbate inequalities by taking from the poor to give to the rich. The pecuniary emulation that Veblen discussed in the theory of leisure class also made the situation much worse. For each class tried to emulate the conspicuous display of the class above them. It wasn't just the elites emulating the ruler, for the middle class tried to emulate the rich, and the poor tried to catch up to the middle class. The worthies in the discourses mention the effects of this competition in the Maladies of the State, the Guoji chapter, chapter 28. They say, while the wealthy strive to surpass one another, the poor try to catch up to the rich. So the rich exhaust all their resources, and the poor end up in debt. This is why the people become more desperate each year, and the problem is accelerating. In the Inequality of Wealth chapter, and elsewhere in the discourses, we see that the worthies and literati assume that the resources of nature, along with human labor resources, are finite, and that conspicuous consumption and the taking of natural resources out of season leads to unsustainable exploitation and the eventual depletion of these resources, undermining the health of the state and the delicate balance of the universe. This was a very long-held cultural assumption going back to at least the spring and autumn period. One can already see a concern with resource depletion and sustainability in various anecdotes in the Zhuojuan and in the Guoyu texts, and of course in the famous allegory of Bull Mountain in the later Mencius texts, which, even though it was deployed for a different rhetorical purpose, it still alerts us to the widespread practice of unsustainable exploitation in China. It also reminds us of Mark Elvin's famous paradox that China's environment and economy had experienced, quote, 3,000 years of unsustainable growth, where the ever-growing population placed enormous demands on the environment and has only escaped Malthusian disaster by finding new environments to despoil and new agricultural technologies. The fact that the Han laws from Zhangjiashan or the monthly ordinances from the Xuanshan site needed to legislate against the taking of immature animals or natural products out of season means that those unsustainable practices were already widespread and that resource depletion was already noticeable to almost everyone. The worthies denounce current practices driven by a ravenous pursuit for delicacies in their great litany. They say, nowadays when the wealthy pursue these animals, they indiscriminately drive them into fine nets and snares, so that even the young fawns and fledgling birds are caught up. At their banquets they wallow in drunkenness, setting out enough wine to fill 100 rivers. For their delicacies they dine on the tender flesh of little lambs, carved up fetal piglets, and the skin peeled from fledgling birds. The literati first raised the problem of conspicuous consumption and the taking of resources out of season, leading to resource depletion in Chapter 3, the circulation of goods chapter, Tongyo. They say things like, if chefs boil and slaughter animal fetuses and birds, eggs, and fry and roast and mix and blending, pursuing the best effect of the 5 flavors, then there will not be enough fish and meat for food. In the present day and age, we are certainly not suffering from an overpopulation of birds and wild game, nor from having more timber resources than we can use. We are troubled by extravagance that knows no bounds. So finally, the most dangerous effects of conspicuous consumption of the Middle Western Han period is summed up by the worthies in their conclusion to the Inequality of Wealth chapter. The extravagance of palace and mansions is like a termite that eats away at timber resources. The carving and polishing of vessels and utensils is like a vermin that nibbles at money and valuable materials. Resplendent clothing is like a voracious moth that chomps away at supplies of hemp and silk. Dogs and horses consuming food meant for people is like a blight upon the grain supply. Overindulgent feasting is like a maggot that consumes supplies of fish and meat. Unrestrained spending is like a leech that bleeds dry the state's treasury and storehouses. Unrestricted waste or embezzlement of grain reserves is like a locust that devours farmlands. Immoderately lavish funeral and sacrifices is like a cancer that harms the living. The word du, that appears 8 times in this paragraph, originally indicated a wood-boring insect like a termite or a grub. It was later used by extension to indicate anything that undermined the foundation or substance of something important. This is how it is used in the famous essay The 5 Vermin, the Wudu, in Han Fei's text, where Han Fei deploys it to characterize those groups like scholars, sophists, vigilantes, merchants, and artisans who undermine the state. While this resource depletion did pose a significant danger to the state, according to the worthies and literati in the Discourses on Salt and Iron, the wealth inequality in the empire was an even more serious, potentially fatal disease. Therefore, when a country experiences a malady such as the inequality in the distribution of resources, the state is in grave peril, they say. Just as with an illness in a human being, an imbalance of vital energy or blood puts the body in mortal danger. For these scholars, wealth inequality generated forces that endanger the states from both ends of the social spectrum. At the upper end, private families, the concentration of wealth in private families could lead to military power capable of overthrowing the state. Even the scholar's opponent, Sang Hongyang, agreed with this point. At the lower end of the spectrum, wealth inequality leads to immiseration of the poor, deep resentment against the state, and ultimately armed revolt. Dong Zhongshu and later Confucian officials added a third avenue of threat to this formulation by bringing in the notion that such inequality and popular resentment would generate a corresponding response from heaven, which would send down natural disasters like droughts or floods or failed harvests. Rulers were supposed to heed these admonitions from heaven. The Confucian critique of conspicuous consumption presumed that the contemporary world had degenerated from a perfect society that existed far in the past, a simpler age where sage kings ruled over an orderly people. These sage kings like Yao and Shun lived very frugal lives and did not carve and decorate their residences or wear sumptuous clothing and ornaments. Their simple lifestyles encouraged their officials and commoners to emulate them, so they remained focused and content in their fundamental work and did not engage in extravagance. According to the Inequality of Wealth chapter, the common people during this time worked hard year-round at farming. They lived in loose cave dwellings, subterranean houses, or log cabins with pelt or grass on the floor. They wore only deer pelts or simple hempen clothing. Unless people were elderly, they got silk. They were shod in straw sandals or wooden clogs. They ate mostly coarse grains and plain vegetables and ate meat only on festival days, and they only drank water from their cupped hands. They only drank alcohol on ritual occasions. They never took game, birds, or fish out of season. They transported items in solid disc-wheeled carts and rode on horses bareback. They banged on earthen drums or struck a stone for music. They never bought prepared foods in the marketplace. They married only one woman. They conducted simple ancestral sacrifices a couple times a year, and they buried their dead in simple clay or wooden coffins. In slightly later times, meaning during the 3 dynasties of Xiaxiangzhou, the king and his high officials were afforded markers of status, including ritual bronzes, silk clothing, and for the king, a harem of concubines and a stable of horses. But the number and amount of these were controlled through ritual decorum and sumptuary regulations, which had been created by the sages, so the people did not compete to overreach their social station. While the ancient sages like Yao and Shun provided models for frugal behavior, in the Confucian argument, notoriously profligate rulers whose dynasties were extinguished provided the admonition. The most egregious of these were Zhou, or Di Xin, the last king of the Shang dynasty, whose escapades make the debauchery and extravagance of Caligula and Nero look reserved in comparison. In the more recent cultural memory of the Han scholars, the first emperor of Qin, Qin Shi Huang, provided an admonition of an extravagant ruler whose dynasty collapsed suddenly. The Taoists and the legalist writers also envisioned a simpler ancient past, without extravagant spending and display. But only the Taoists wanted to return to what they considered an idyllic age, which was not polluted with human artifice, like government and laws. For the legalists, in the 5 Vermin chapter of the Han Feizi text, Han Fei describes an archaic past where people lived in wooden nests in trees and ate mostly raw food like berries and shellfish until a sage invented fire. Food and clothing were plentiful because the population was very small, so people did not have to struggle to support themselves. Since there was abundance, people did not compete over resources or value wealth or material possessions. But for Han Fei, this past was irretrievably lost. There was no way to return to this simpler age because the population of the world was so much greater, and political and social circumstances had completely changed. It was far wiser to adapt to the current age and to make harsh laws to restrain unwanted behaviors. Now, in the Laozi, as we see on the screen in this famous passage from chapter 80, the Taoists envisioned an ideal past, or possibly a utopian future, brought about by the sage. Given a small country with few inhabitants, he could bring it about that though there should be among the people contrivances requiring 10 times, 100 times of labor, they would not use them. And we go on to talk about the place where they could hear the cocks crowing in the village next to them, the dogs barking, but people would grow old and die without ever having gone there. So as we see here, just as in the Han Feizi, this archaic past enjoyed a very small population, so people had plenty of food and shelter. They were content in their occupations and showed no desire for material things or luxuries. They did not even want to step outside their villages for trade or interaction with other groups. This mention of using knotted cords to record information is fascinating, and I will return to that very soon. So one question that interests me here is, what was the source for these authors for this version of the distant past? So was it just textual records, or was it their imagination, or was there something else involved here? So remember in chapter 29, we have things like hides for clothing that still have the hooves on them, carts with solid disc wheels, cave dwellings and pit homes, bareback horse riding, floors covered in pelts. In the Laozi, the things like the knotted cords, and the Han Feizi, living in trees and eating raw food. Well, many of these things can be found in early textual records like in the Shijing, or in parts of the Shangshu, or in passages from the Li Ji. It's also possible that people came upon ancient ruins, or they might have chance finds of bronze vessels from the three dynasties. But I would suggest that one of the sources for this so-called idyllic distant past was the present, or the contemporary age, and this is something called ethnographic analogy. So anthropologists define this as our modern ancestor. This idea that groups around us at a lower level of social complexity represent the way we used to be, represent our past. It was first used during the Enlightenment by people like the Marquis de Condorcet. It was later used by Lewis Henry Morgan and other modern anthropologists. So I would suggest that during the Han and the Warring States, there were uncivilized pockets throughout China where people of very primitive lifestyles still lived, still existed. And that these people's practices were taken to represent the way people used to be. We know that in Han material culture, no one rode around in solid disc wheel carts, but we do know from modern archaeology that solid disc wheel carts did precede vehicles that had spokes. And so it could be that there were still groups riding around with these solid disc wheeled vehicles, or riding horses bareback, or still wearing hides with the hoofs still on them. And so Sima Qian, of course, is the earliest ethnographer in China. His ethnography of the Dian and the Kunming and the Xiongnu and the Yue is our very valuable earliest picture of the actual lifestyle of these different ethnic groups. So Han scholars were aware of people living at a lower level of social complexity. And I would argue that they used this ethnographic analogy to reconstruct the way things were for them, the Chinese, in a distant past. The most fascinating thing, of course, is this idea of using knotted cords to record events or to govern. The earliest mention of this before the Laozi is in the Shizi appendix to the I Ching. In highest antiquity, government was carried on successfully by the use of knotted cords to preserve the memory of things. In subsequent ages, the sages substituted for these written characters. So this idea of knotting cords, there's no archaeological evidence in China that knotted cords preceded writing, and there's no evidence in the graphs of the oracle bone script itself that there was any previous system that used knotted cords like the quipu of the Inca of South America that we see here. But scholars in the early 20th century did know that certain people in southwest China, the Miao group, were still using knotted cords to record things, and that people in the Ryukyu Islands, indigenous peoples, were also using knotted cords. So this may have been a practice that was seen by the Chinese in non-Chinese groups that lived around them, and thus was then reconstructed to be their ancient past. So let me talk briefly about the counter-argument. So in the Discourses on Salt and Iron, Sang Hongyang gives his counter-argument to the Confucian argument against conspicuous consumption. So in this earlier chapter, in chapter 3, the Tongyou chapter, he presents his counter-argument to this Confucian indictment that conspicuous consumption was immoral, led to unsustainable resource exploitation, and constituted the primary cause of wealth inequality that bedeviled the country. For Sang, the resources of nature were boundless, and there was plenty to go around for everyone. The main cause of wealth inequality for him was the uneven distribution of resources throughout the empire. So he argues here that the resources of heaven and earth are limitless in supply, and the products of the mountains and seas represent boundless wealth. If the people are still destitute and lack sufficient means to support themselves, then the real cause is that surplus and scarcity have not been properly regulated, and that the world's bounty has not been well circulated. For Sang, it was quite appropriate that high officials should enjoy a measure of wealth, and that they and their families were entitled to status-marking luxuries as well. He defends the luxurious lifestyles of high officials like himself, saying that those who hold a high-ranking official position should enjoy a generous salary. This is as natural as a powerful tree trunk having flourishing tree branches. He then cites famous examples from antiquity, including the wealth and benefits obtained by Bo Qin, the son of the Duke of Zhou, concluding that it was, quote, conventional among the ancients to refer to wealth as an acceptably fine thing. But Sang Hongyang was opposed to the wealth accumulation and extravagance by private industrialists and powerful families, the Haoqiang Dajia, who might use and expend that wealth to attract followers, arrogate powers, and potentially rebel against the throne. He claims that suppressing such illicit and dangerous extravagance was one of the main reasons that Emperor Wu originally sanctioned the government monopolies on salt and iron in the first place. And while Song does criticize pronounced extravagance, at least by non-officials or non-royals, he also denounced excessive or performative frugality. Paraphrasing the Analects, he states, while the gentleman restrains his own extravagance, he also criticizes parsimoniousness, for being overly frugal leads to shabbiness. Again, citing Confucius, he points out that the master criticized overly stingy persons, for he believed that they created difficult living conditions for their servants or clients. Sang was completely unconvinced that high officials who made a performance of their very frugal lifestyle really encouraged people to restrain their own extravagance or had any positive impact on the empire. He and his mouthpiece in the debate cite the case of the former chief minister, the elderly Confucian Gongsun Hong, who paraded around the palace bureaus wearing simple hempen clothes and eating meager, coarse meals. Yet this did not stop the rebellious plot of Liu An, the regional lord of Huainan, during his watch, nor prevent barbarians from making incursions along the borders. It was simply empty performance. Now, a modern economist might argue that conspicuous consumption by the wealthy and lower classes could be seen as a positive force in the economy, for it stimulates production and trade and generates greater economic growth and fuller employment of the labor forces. Sang Hongyang was by no means a modern economic thinker, but he did already realize this side of the issue. At one point in the debate, he quotes the Guanzi, saying, "If one did not decorate palaces and houses, then timber resources would not be fully utilized and would go to waste. If they were not used to stock our kitchens, there'd be nothing to reduce the life expectancy of game and fowl, leading to dangerous overpopulation. Without the profit derived from secondary occupations, the farmer would have no outlet for his produce. If there were no embroidered ceremonial robes, then seamstresses could not fully deploy their skill, meaning find full employment." Thus, for Sang Hongyang, conspicuous consumption helps to absorb overabundant resources and excess labor, while also circulating goods and natural resources that are unevenly distributed throughout the empire. So let me go through my conclusions now. So the Inequality of Wealth chapter of the Discourses on Salt and Iron reveals a remarkable snapshot of conspicuous consumption and pecuniary emulation during the early 1st century BCE in China. Due to the unique structure of the chapter, which presents a prepared litany of 32 cases of extravagance, we are given a detailed picture of the competitive display among the wealthy, middle class, and the urban lower class in Han China, with many different areas of material culture and social practice. And because the litany mimics the Han Rhapsody genre of verse with its enrapturing deployment of specialized words, we obtain invaluable information about fabulous textiles, elaborate culinary dishes, dazzling horse gear, and extravagant funerary monuments. Despite the withering criticism of conspicuous consumption leveled by the worthies and the literati during the debate, very little actually changed concerning people's spending habits. The government did remove the monopoly on alcohol marketing, temporarily closed a few iron factories in the capital area, and reduced a few expenditures. The wealthy and the middle classes continued trying to keep up with the Joneses just as before. And while China's monetized and increasingly globalized economy continued to develop, the chasm between the rich and the poor continued to widen. The most revealing evidence for this trend was the aggrandizement of large landed estates by the wealthy who bought up the farms of indebted peasants and rented out the farmlands at exorbitant rates. And while this impoverishment clearly contributed to the general discontent that fed millenarian rebellions in the twilight years of the dynasty, the complete cataclysm of starvation and economic collapse predicted by the scholars as a result of conspicuous consumption and the abandonment of farming never really occurred. The Inequality of Wealth chapter is the earliest sustained and detailed indictment of wealth inequality from any culture in world history. While earlier Han scholars like Jia Shan, Chao Cuo, Dong Zhongshu had criticized extravagant spending by the emperor and the upper-level elites and decried its impact on wealth inequality, This chapter in the Discourses is the first instance where we can witness the deleterious effects of the competition to display wealth all the way down the social ladder. These condemnations of wealth and conspicuous display from early China are not unique in the ancient world. We see them in classical Greece, in the anti-wealth discourse associated with democracy of Athens, and the anti-oligarch ideology. In the Roman world, other than from the Stoics, there is no sustained criticism of wealth accumulation and appalling gap between rich and poor until Jesus of Nazareth preached the immorality of wealth in the early 1st century. Remember the quote, "It is easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." If we take the arguments in the Discourses on Salt and Iron at face value, then we could say that the worthies and the literati seem to genuinely care about the plight of the poor and the fate of the agrarian economy. Looking at their arguments a bit more critically and historically, we could view them as conservative idealists who were troubled by the effects of globalization and monetization on society and the economy, and just wanted to return to an idealized past that they envisioned to be simpler, both economically and socially, and slower paced. Or perhaps we could look at their arguments very cynically. The worthies, who gave the great litany of conspicuous consumption in the Inequality of Wealth chapter of the Discourses, were not Confucian classicists for the most part. Scholars who have studied the Discourses have often lumped them together with the literati as representing a unified Confucian front in the debate, but more recent analyses have been able to distinguish distinct voices for each group on a number of key issues. The nomination category of Xianliang, which we translate as worthies, were designed for men of great ability and upright character who were well versed in both book learning and national affairs. The category was initiated under Emperor Wu, and famous Confucian scholars like Gongsun Hong had entered into service at the beginning under this designation. For the court discussion in 81 BC, however, the worthies had been nominated by the governors of the 3 capital districts, the Sanfu, and the minister of ceremonials, the Taichang, a high government official in charge of ritual, who acted as chief administrator of the prosperous tomb towns, Lingyi, which were built next to the necropolises of the former Han emperors. These were the densely populated and bustling suburbs of the capital to which Emperor Wu had relocated many of the wealthy and prominent families of the empire. So the worthies in this debate were unlike the literati, who were all noted Confucian scholars from the provinces. The worthies were in fact city men, accustomed to the bustling urban culture of the capital. This also makes sense, for to be conversant in the later trends of conspicuous consumption, the trends of conspicuous display and the banquet fare that we see in the Inequality of Wealth chapter, they would have had to have witnessed them firsthand. They may in fact have been from rich and powerful families themselves, or have been handpicked to be their representatives, which should cause us to take a harder look at their argument for austerity in court spending and their call to remove the government monopolies on salt, iron, and liquor. Along this avenue of thought, I suggest that the worthies were just employing the old Confucian tropes of austerity and returning to the rude occupation and to a simpler past as a way to protect their own privileges and wealth, or those of the powerful men who nominated them for government service. The worthies and their powerful backers might have opposed the government monopolies and price equalization schemes of Sang Hongyang because they hijacked their private industrial enterprises and the profits from commodity speculation that supported their lifestyles. Similarly, by arguing for a return to the past, when only the aristocrats and upper classes were allowed to display wealth and status markers, the worthies may have hoped to suppress the nouveau riche who were fast on their heels. One could even argue that the so-called poor Confucian scholars in the provinces, the literati, might have also been serving powerful provincial interests and did not really seem to care about the miseration of the poor. They just wanted to return to a past when they, as the keepers of textual authority of the classics, had the exclusive ear of the ruler, and not those upstart and uncouth technocrats like Sang Hongyang. Ratcheting up our cynicism even further, we could examine the motivations of the man who instigated this debate in the first place, Huo Guang, the virtual regent for Emperor Zhao and the de facto emperor of China for 2 successive generations. Did he sincerely regret the excesses of Emperor Wu's reign and encourage government retrenchment in the economic and military spheres, as Homer Dubs and Michael Lowy have suggested? Or was he just using the venue of the court conference to air these Confucian arguments of the scholars, thereby attacking his great rival at court, Sang Hongyang, and cementing his control over the young emperor? Huo Guang was lifted up out of the middle-class background because he and his half-brother Huo Qubing were nephews of one of Emperor Wu's consorts. As he rose in favor and power, he outwardly projected a circumspect and frugal demeanor and was instrumental in promoting Confucian ideology at court, ostensibly through the imperial edicts of Emperor Zhao and Emperor Xuan, which Huoguang had probably written himself. As virtual regent to two young emperors, he encouraged the view that he was acting like the Confucian hero, the Duke of Zhou, in protecting the young monarchs without any self-interest. In spite of this outward display, however, Huoguang was an exceedingly greedy man, and he and his family hoarded great amounts of wealth over his decades in power. We hear that upon Huoguang's death, he was buried with an enormous amount of hoarded wealth, with all the trappings of an emperor, including a jade suit. His hypocritical fraud would be repeated less than 75 years later by Wang Mang, who also projected a circumspect, austere, outward appearance and promoted this return to the ancients Confucian ideology. While he acted out this ploy of impersonating the Duke of Zhou as regent for conveniently young and weak Han emperors, Wang Mang and his family amassed huge personal fortunes. As emperor of his own dynasty, he hoarded gold in his palace on a scale never before witnessed in human history. Just the betrothal present to the family of his second wife consisted of over 7 million grams of gold, in addition to slaves, silk, pearls, jade, and other treasures. So this is how we can view them as hypocrites. Thank you very much.